this channel recently, we have taken a look at the spread of certain strains of Nintendo platforms in various parts of the world. While most people are aware of what went down in the United States and Japan, we have been focusing on other regions, which has included looking at the spread of both the Indian and UK variants of NES hardware. Speaking of variants, while both the UK and India both have particularly interesting strains, today we look at the Brazilian variant, a console that would try to conquer the largest market in South America. I am Lady Decade, and I am back once again to cover another chapter in underrepresented global gaming history. This is a story of the NES in Brazil. But to join me today to provide as much clarity as possible on this rather niche subject, I will be joined by Stika, retro gaming YouTuber and native Portuguese speaker, to help give us all the full scoop. So now over to the man himself.
The NES, the uncontested winner of the 8-bit console wars. The system that put Nintendo on the map as a console manufacturer and cemented its place in gaming history, with hundreds of absolutely brilliant games that are still fun to play to this day. Yes, the NES was an incredible success in Japan, US and Canada. But what about other countries where Nintendo had no presence and no official distributor? Well, my friends, this is the story of the 8-bit Nintendo Entertainment System in Brazil. Or should I say, the Gradiente Phantom System in Brazil.
What? This isn't part of the deal, you've tricked me! This isn't an officially licensed Nintendo release of the NES. This sounds like you're talking about a famiclone!
That's right! This weird amalgamation of an Atari 7800 shell, a Sega Mega Drive controller, and a Master System light gun was actually how Brazil was introduced to the NES. Though over there, they would come to know it as the Phantom System by Gradiente.
Okay, fair enough. I guess the NES Brazilian variant we were meant to talk about in today's video doesn't exist and it was all a hoax. You see, being a large developing nation much like India, who we covered in a previous episode, Brazil have some pretty bizarre trade laws that often prevent the movement of certain goods into the country. Amongst these rules are ridiculously high import tariffs on all foreign electronics. As discussed previously, the only economical way that Nintendo could operate in any country with such harsh trade restrictions would be via finding a local distributor to sell the product in their name on their behalf, just like Samurai Electronics in India and Hyundai in South Korea. With this strategy clearly not working, Nintendo were not willing to make the same mistake again in Brazil. However, this would lead to Sega doing what Nintendo don't, teaming up with a local Brazilian company, Tectoy, who would ultimately turn both the Sega Master System and Sega Mega Drive into top-selling legendary systems in the region. But today is about Nintendo, so let's discuss the dubious methods that Brazilian gamers would implement to experience their regular dose of the big N, and that I suppose brings us back to the Gradiente Phantom System, this bizarre looking hodgepodge of a device.
But who is Gradiente? And how did this weird chimera of a console come to be? Well, Gradiente is a Brazilian electronics company founded in 1964 that still exists to this day. They began making record players and sound amplifiers before moving to televisions and eventually making the first DVD player in Brazil. And during the 80s and 90s, they saw the profitable gaming market in the US established by Atari and would become the official distributor of the Atari 2600 in Brazil. In fact, Gradiente's gaming history is super interesting. Over the next 20 years, they would either make or distribute gaming systems from Atari, Nintendo, and even the MSX. For all intents and purposes, over the course of 2 decades, they were the Nintendo of Brazil, Atari of Brazil, and part of the MSX manufacturing scene in that country. But yeah, as the early 80s moved on, the Atari 2600 was becoming outdated. So they met up with Atari reps in the United States to become the official Brazilian distributor of its successor, the Atari 7800. However, during one of the various consumer electronics shows in the US, one of Gradiente's reps saw the NES and how much more successful it was than the Atari 7800. So it was decided that, instead of continuing their distribution deal with Atari, they would instead focus on the NES. At first, Nintendo of Japan was not keen on the idea, as they did not see the point in developing an NES variant for Brazil's analog TV system PAL-M, especially when you consider that Brazil was often ripe with piracy and Atari clones. But Gradiente was not one to back down, so they bought a couple of NES systems, reverse-engineered them, and created their own Brazilian NES hardware, which they then took to Nintendo of Japan for approval.
So, wait a minute. This doesn't actually sound like your typical Taiwanese famiclone story, and Gradiente legitimately went above and beyond to try to acquire official licensing rights. The company sound like they did everything possible to overcome the barriers Nintendo claimed were posed that prevented them from providing Brazilian gamers with official Nintendo hardware. So, what would unfold when the company's higher-ups spoke to Nintendo about what they had created?
Maurice Arditi, the vice president of Gradiente, described his meeting with Nintendo in a recent interview.
We bought the NES and a few NTSC televisions and adapted the console to work properly on PAL-M displays. We then took our prototype to Japan and showed it to Nintendo in a boardroom meeting. They were shocked to see the games running in color on a PAL-M television. We proved we could make it work. So does it work? Yes. Ready to do business? No. Maurice Arditi, Vice President of Gradiente.
Gradiente left the meeting disappointed, but they were not about to give up. They already had the technology to run Nintendo games, so they didn't really need Nintendo to sell their system. And selling their system was exactly the plan. Reverse engineering and building the NES wasn't really all that difficult, considering the console mostly used off-the-shelf parts. The tricky part was creating the pin connector that could read Western cartridges. But before long, they had their design finalized. So they set up factories in Brazil, repurposed the shells they were originally going to use for the Atari 7800, copied the designs of the Sega Mega Drive controller and the Master System Light Phaser, and there you go! The Phantom System was now ready to launch. And the funniest part is, absolutely none of this was illegal. Nintendo had no representation in Brazil, so this means that there were no patents for the NES hardware in the country. And not only that, but Gradiente actually went ahead and patented the Phantom System themselves. Yes, not only was this legal in Brazil, but they even made sure to patent their designs over there, which meant that if Nintendo ever wanted to launch in the country, they would have to go through them first. Just, man, that is such a power move!
Look at that giant bird!
That is literally the perfect revenge. They gave Nintendo perfect opportunity to do business, and Nintendo threw it in their face and made a stupid protectionist move and cost themselves big time. What actual idiots!
And now all that was left was to make the games themselves, which they did. They would contact video game publishers in the US and acquire the rights to publish the games in Brazil, using their own NES cartridges. And the best part is, even though they're clearly using NES cartridge molds, you would not see a single reference to Nintendo in the actual packaging. As far as anyone in Brazil knew, this was a console by Gradiente with games published by Gradiente. Just goddammit Brazil, you have got the biggest balls I've ever seen. And to make it even more outrageous, because they own the patents, they could sell the consoles and games without paying any royalties, which made them even cheaper. But on the other hand, this meant that they could not publish Nintendo's own games, meaning you would not find Super Mario, Legend of Zelda or Metroid for sale. So instead, for their launch lineup, you could buy a Phantom System that came with one of 4 possible pack-in games: Super Pitfall, Gauntlet, Predator, and Ghostbusters.
So basically the Phantom was far more than just a famiclone, as the whole operation was above board and the games were officially licensed. No Chinese knockoffs in this story. Yet.
And in fact, there's a theory that the name Phantom System was chosen because of Ghostbusters, as the movie was still super popular in Brazil and was a pack-in title. They would even make a point to bring games based on movies or popular franchises to help sell the system, something which was prominently displayed in their advertising.
Você tá pronta? Eu vou na frente, você me segue.
Phantom System, videogame de última geração. Compre essa briga. Phantom System. Nunca foi tão emocionante ficar em casa.
Now, you might think that playing NES without Mario, Zelda or Metroid is heresy. But thankfully, Brazilian gamers actually could play those games. As you can imagine, piracy and bootlegs were very common in Brazil. So shortly after the Phantom System's launch, you would start seeing other clones surfacing, such as the Dynavision, Top Game, Beat System, High Top Game, among others, as well as bootleg cartridges. Now the problem is that, like their Famicom counterparts, these bootleg carts would use 60 pins, while the NES and Phantom System used 72-pin slots. But thankfully, you could readily and cheaply buy adapters almost anywhere where games were sold. So in the end, it was still possible to play Super Mario on your Phantom System.
So wait a minute. If it took NES-style carts, surely, if it was to be classed as any type of system, it wouldn't be a famiclone. It would be a Nintendo Enter-clonement system?
Another thing I should point out is that I cannot seem to find definitive proof as to the launch date of the Phantom System. Some sources seem to claim 1988, while others will state 1989. But considering the console uses the Mega Drive controller, I tend to lean towards the latter. Now, despite what you might think, the Phantom System was actually a pretty good piece of hardware. As it turns out, it was more durable than the NES, particularly where the pin connector is concerned, as well as being more energy efficient. According to Gradiente, this was all because the console's production was entirely handled in Brazil, instead of being outsourced to China, so it was easier to keep an eye on production quality and avoid defective yields.
I didn't know the reason the NES was unreliable was because parts were manufactured in China. Well, that must be the Joy-Cons explained now too. No Tokyo Drift here.
Additionally, I should also point out that Brazil has historically always had a high import tax. Whether it's clothing, televisions, games or consoles, your product could cost up to 70% more than it would otherwise due to taxation, a measure which still exists in Brazil to this day. And it would not be until 2020 when this tax would be reduced to 40%, which is still outrageous if you ask me. I mean, when converted to US dollars, even a base Nintendo Switch costs almost $500. So in the end, it was simply cheaper to manufacture all of it in Brazil. And despite there being competition from other NES clone manufacturers, Gradiente dominated the market because it was a well-established electronics brand with a solid distribution system, logistics, and the money to back it up. But despite all of this, they still had to deal with another competitor, an upstart toy company who began to sell the NES's competitor, the Master System, and at roughly around the same time. And as we all know, the Master System became the de facto winner of that generation in Brazil. The funny thing is, Tectoy's Master System was much more expensive as the console itself was imported. But despite that, whether due to popularity, marketing, or maybe due to the fact that the Brazilian NES game lineup was often constrained as Gradiente could not sell Nintendo's own games officially. Whatever the reason might be, the fact is, the Master System was the more popular console despite being more expensive. Still, as you can imagine, Tectoy, who at the time was still relatively small, was not too happy about competing with a giant, well-established Brazilian corporation who managed to game the legal system in their favor so as to sell their console and games at a much lower price. So because of this, Tectoy devised a plan. And are you ready for this? They wanted to convince Nintendo to officially launch in Brazil. I kid you not, Sega's official distributor in Brazil wanted to bring Nintendo to Brazil! That is insane! Yes, Tectoy's co-founder Stefan Arnold would go to every consumer electronics show and try to convince the Nintendo reps that they should expand to Brazil because it's such a large market. All of this because, if Nintendo came to Brazil, one of two things would happen. Either Gradiente is forced out of the market, or they would have to pay up royalties for each console and game sold, thereby driving up the price of the Phantom System. Either way, it's a win for Tectoy. Man, that is some next level corporate sabotage. Gradiente was good, but Tectoy was playing 4D chess on a 3D chessboard. And the craziest part is, it worked!
Oh, so the NES did officially launch in Brazil. The Brazilian variant was real all this time. What sort of moron would believe a variant is a hoax anyway?
I mean, we don't know if it was because of Tectoy or not, but we do know that it did happen, and Gradiente was forced to negotiate with Nintendo. And that meant paying royalties and discontinuing the Phantom System in favor of the NES. So as you can imagine, this meant that the price of the NES and NES games went up as they now had to pay Nintendo royalties. But Tectoy was not alone, because Gradiente was also playing 4D chess. So what Gradiente did is establish a new company and a new brand called FalconSoft. A brand which would sell pirated NES bootleg games without Nintendo's consent. Yes, the official distributor of Nintendo was also selling pirated bootleg copies on the side. Just, what is this? Is this real life anymore? I can't tell. I can't tell. And the funniest thing is, they would change the names of the games as well. So Super Mario became Super Irmãos, or Super Brothers. Excite Bike became Super Bike, Duck Hunt became Caça ao Pato, and so on and so forth. So whenever Nintendo complained about these pirate cartridges, all Gradiente had to do was play dumb and tell them it was a different company. Can you imagine? The suits at Gradiente just lying to the face of Nintendo reps, pretending they never heard of FalconSoft or that it doesn't exist?
It's false. No way. It's totally made up. Pure fiction. It's fiction. It's fiction. It's a made-up tale. It's a total fabrication. It never happened. It never happened. This one was invented by a writer. Not this time. It never happened.
That is just incredible! And despite that, Gradiente would be Nintendo's official distributor in Brazil up until 2003 when they opted out of the market, citing dwindling sales, increased competition, piracy, and the high value of the dollar, which made it more difficult to import.
So what you're saying is, the official Nintendo distributor runs an illegal bootleg operation on the side, under a different name, and then tell Nintendo they can't work with them any longer due to problems with piracy. Who runs Gradiente? Gus bloody Fring!
Now, I won't get into Nintendo's full history in Brazil, because that is one long and convoluted story. But suffice it to say that they always had a rocky history with this particular market. I mean, yeah, Gradiente was already a rocky start, but in 2015, for example, Nintendo opted out of the Brazilian market and left it completely, and would only re-enter it in late 2020. But between that period, there were no Nintendo consoles or games being sold in the country. So yeah, it's a very rocky history. But regardless, if the Phantom System was already losing to the Master System, the now higher priced NES didn't even stand a chance. But as previously said, Gradiente would continue publishing Nintendo systems, so the war with Sega, or Tectoy to be more precise, continued throughout the 16-bit generation, which I'll get into in a future video. But for now, I think we can all appreciate what an interesting and unique history Brazil shared with the 8-bit console wars, and especially the NES. And you know what? While we're at it, I gotta say, the Phantom System is a way cooler name if you ask me.
So I have to admit, you caught me off guard here, as I genuinely didn't think that Nintendo had ever entered the Brazilian market, and the history of the Gradiente Phantom System is far juicier and messier than what I was expecting from on the surface. A device which seems like any other famiclone. I'm very impressed with Gradiente's balls and the way they are willing to mess with Nintendo with shady business practices, giving them a taste of their own medicine for a change. By the time the Nintendo 64 came around, no wonder they were frightened of pirates. Who needs enemies when they have friends like this? Thank you so much, Stika, for telling this amazing story. Please subscribe to Stika's channel if you want more content like this, or if you like what I'm doing, then subscribe to mine.
Hey everyone, thank you for watching Stika's Retro Corner. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell and share this video. All that fun social media stuff, and you can also support me on Patreon. It may not seem like it, but even $1 is a really big help in keeping this channel going. I also want to thank a couple of my Patreon supporters like Anthony Ryan Bennett and Genru. Anyway, I hope you have a great day. Bye!